Speaking French. Okay. We don't interfere with each other from room to room.
I'm naturally loud. So
Awkward.
I'm gonna have to deal with that.
The Pope will be speaking on behalf of.
Hello.
Hello.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much, colleagues, for joining us for this session on disruptive housing solutions for a resilient and sustainable Africa. We speak on behalf of, or we are representing a collective, international collective on Canadian, Chinese, and African sustainable urbanism, or what we call ICASU. I invite you to look at the brochures near your seat. I have put some brochures near your seat to introduce our collective and to introduce the work we're doing. I would like to start by thanking the tech team in the back who have been very helpful to us, and because the time is really of essence here, I would like to start this session with the opening remarks, but by Mr. Ramos Silla that will be delivered by Mr. Claude Ngomsi. Claude, please.
Thank you for this opportunity, and thank you to all those who are in the room with us. On behalf of Umar Silla, the Regional Director for Africa, I would like to once more recognize the contribution of ICASU and all the university working with ICASU during the World Urban Forum. The issue of disrupting houses, the solution for a resilient, sustainable Africa is very important, because we really aim to see how we can think differently going further in the context where we have currently around 58 million housing deficit, adequate housing deficit, and this is going to increase going further. So how do we revisit our housing concept? How do we reconstruct house? and housing value chain, from access to land servicing, to the provision of infrastructure and social collective equipment, until the construction, financing, but more importantly, the maintenance and management of not only housing, but the settlement in the housing. And I think all the participants, as well as more importantly, all the speakers will give us some insight that we will use and maybe have a takeaway to rethink a new Africa with that disrupting housing approach. Thank you.
And now we move to the keynote speech by Dr. Hassan Radwan, who is joining us via Zoom.
Hello, do you hear me, please? Please, or now? Hello? Do you hear me, please? Do you hear me? Hello?
Yes, I do. We hear you very well.
Yeah, please, because I am online. You need to confirm that I am in the room, because sometimes organizers, they put me in the backstage. So always remind the organizers to put me in the stage, please. So do we need now to introduce ourselves, or I will start the presentation?
Please do briefly introduce yourself and start your presentation.
Yes, thank you so much. Hassan Radwan is a full professor of architecture and urban planning, and now is the managing director of CityNov. Is actually a mega research lab and agency for integrated territorial planning and smart cities. And previously, the director of the School of Architecture, Planning and Design at UM6P, Polytechnic University, working as an architect planner on the questions of urban planning, master planning, territorial management.
Sorry, Dr. Hassan, Dr. Radwan, you're cutting off.
Of course, housing issues for the last. Yes, yeah. This is my presentation. Can I share it from my side, please? Can I share it from my side?
No, the tech team here says it's unfortunately impossible, but I have it all here and I can flip the screen for you.
Okay, please. Please move to the next slide, please, if you can. Yeah. So anyhow, I don't want actually to deal with this question of housing or housing issues solely at the housing scale. So as you may know, among I'm talking about the African continent, there is actually demographic kind of dynamics with an urbanization rate that is really high, maybe the highest globally. So therefore, this highest urbanization rate prompting all the time that we try to solve more the housing issues in Africa. But the key issue by this high rate of urbanization for resolving the questions of housing get us to more like cities dormitories, or cities only for housing, or for domestic housing. And this is actually a phenomenon that create a lot of issues and of course creates negative consequences on the infrastructure performance, environmental performance, social performance, and of course all the other performances at the level of the cities. So therefore, I always link the problems of housing to the problem of urbanization and urbanization trends. I will add something that what exacerbates these problems of housing in Africa is actually the modern urban planning that is very that is based on zoning, and therefore there is actually that's the purposes, and this actually creates a lot of issue of housing in urbanization, with job creation, with creating new opportunities, with education, with health performance, hygienic performance. So therefore, there is a serious issue of getting to a more integrative and, of course, interactive, multi-sectorial level to get the city to perform as a holistic urban ensemble rather than to be exclusively for housing. And actually, this question of making this modern urban planning based on rigid zoning create more social housing. And by creating these social housings, we have another issue that large number of the community, they cannot get access to housing. So what they do, they resort to informality. So there are a lot of informal settlements in Africa just because of the rigid top-down urban planning and urbanization. Next slide, please. Next slide. So now what's next slide? So this is actually the challenges and the opportunities. I'm not dealing with the housing issues. And of course, I will come to why we titled this session Disruptive Solutions for Housing. I will come to that. And especially this term disruptive, or this adjective, the disruptive, is very important. It's not just like disruptive solutions, but of course to disrupt even the mindset, the way we look about housing issues. So this rapid urbanization in Africa, it creates opportunities. It's a real catalyst for job creation, for infrastructure improvement, for actually urban growth in a positive way. We may actually even resolve environmental issues if we have very good master planning based on ecological and, of course, environmental performances. But at the same time, this actually rapid urbanization increases demand for adequate housing, because what the problem, we have quantitative approach for solving housing issues that actually always generates quantitative social housing that becomes like a plague in all cityscapes of Africa. And of course, the second thing, the quality infrastructure. The major problem of the African city or African metropolis is actually that infrastructure always is meager, always is inadequate because of the high population density, or maybe, of course, the traffic is not adequate to what is actually concrete on the ground in terms of traffic engineering. And the last point is actually the urge to bring this layer, this qualitative layer of resilience and sustainability that is indeed a challenge. Next slide, please. And what we need to now to think about this, what African continents can innovate in terms of housing within a more revisited urban planning that is not top-down, but bottom-up, including, the question of inclusive communities with the lens of resilience and sustainability to come to respond to the global SDGs. But in the same time, we need to devise local responses to this global phenomena of climate change and, of course, the problem of sustainability. So there are actually different agendas, and even within the Africa urban agenda, one of the things that I've really appreciated, this Africa is looking forward to the attainment of the Agenda 2063, a long-term regional agenda to achieve development in the decades. The process will be supported by Sustainable Development Goals, of course, and the outcome of Habitat 3, which will define the urban agenda for the next 20 years. So, of course, within the scope of this interaction with global and local, global and regional, global and territorial, what kind of smart resolutions that are, I will underscore this term, contextual, local, not only strategic, metaphysical SDG orientations, especially SDG 11, but how we can contextualize the global strategic objectives, but of course with a local and textual innovation. Next, please. Next, please. So therefore, just to take the case of Morocco, I mean, I'm not here trying to say that Morocco is ideal in terms of urbanization. So we are witnessing, like any other African country, a very high rate of urbanization nationwide. The only thing, there is a very important, actually, aménagement territorial. That means territorial management, nationwide and the national territory, not to densify only one or two urban centralities. Like, for instance, to give an example, in Egypt, very large in a country, and you have only two urban centers or two big cities or one metropolis, another mega city. So, but I think Morocco resorted more to distribution of urban centers in different regions in the country in order to have a regional urban centers rather than one national urban hub that will be a mega metropolis. And you know, metropolises in Africa are not easy to handle because we are not ready like the global north in terms of technology, in terms of infrastructure, in terms of performance indicators, including housing indicators. So therefore we need to be very careful with making a balance between the size of the cities, the population densities within these cities, and how we need to distribute the urban growth nationwide rather than to be centralized on one or two centers like, you know, Kinshasa or Lagos or Cairo. Now the population will exceed actually 10, 15, 20 millions. So it's not obvious to handle neither housing nor environmental quality in these cities. So next, please. So when I want to reach here, there is actually a problem now Africa-wise in terms of housing quality based on this rigid zoning. That means the legal framework, you know, the legal framework that comes with the top-down master planning. It creates a lot of issues for community, of course, to respond to its housing needs. So how can we actually, I'm saying it's so important to have this strategic master planning. It's a must at national level, but it needs, of course, to be also very dynamic, very innovative, and of course, very responsive in order to meet the challenges of housing for local communities, that they are not actually looking just for this master planning to be implemented verbatim, but they need to get access to housing as soon as possible. It would be absurd, like in a city like Accra, where some families, they live in a bidonville or an informal housing for 50 years. Some of them, they are there for 80 years in slums. So it's absurd that we leave human beings living in slums for almost a century. So that means there is an issue of aligning master planning and, of course, the needs of housing at the national level and the execution rate, and, of course, the legal flexibility, agility in order to respond to these growing needs. Next, please. Next, please. So next, I wish to have the hand on my slides, but it's okay. So now we are facing in most African cities two kind of phenomena. One is actually the urban extensions. This is actually the classical urbanization that is mushrooming everyone, devouring resources. And most of these urbanization trends, they are on agricultural lands or fertile lands or next to mountains, etc. And they are really not measured in terms of how they expand on devouring resources, devouring energy, etc. And on the other hand, you have these social housing projects. They are run by private and public entities, but they are not all the time observing these questions of resilience and sustainability or ecological issues or social issues. So I think in Africa, we need to be more careful in terms of how we set these housing strategies aligned with national, regional, territorial planning in order to observe, of course, the damage to be done by this mushrooming urbanization and housing big ensembles on natural resources. Next, please. Next, please. Next, please. Next, just pass this one because I need to be quick. Next, please. So there is actually, please previous slide, there is a phenomena Africa-wise. Since the classical cities, metropolises, they are, previous slide please, previous slide. So there is a phenomenon now in Africa of new towns, les villes nouvelles, these new cities. Since actually cities are overcrowded, so we can't actually keep the city mushrooming, expanding in its urbanization, classical urbanization extension. Some states all over Africa, they wanted to devise new towns, new cities. In Morocco, we are witnessing 3 generations of these cities. The first generation of Ville Nouvelle or new towns, they were like a big failure because they were just like absorbing housing issues, housing crisis, and therefore they were just like, you know, dislocating people to new towns in order to create big dormitory district, and they call them Ville Nouvelle. But now actually with the new trend now under U6P, like the university that you see behind me with the group OCP, there is actually a new generation of cities that are not only for housing, not only for a dormitory purpose, but also they are centered around knowledge and of course the economy of technology, the economy of innovation, research. And they think this kind of cities, new generation of cities based on knowledge and based on, of course, innovation, they are so needed all over Africa. Cities now, like metropolises, they are classical bodies. They are actually, they need a lot of upgrading. They need a lot of restructuration. They need a lot of infrastructure improvements. So they are so heavy to maintain. And of course, what actually now a trend to create some cities a priori in their master planning with mixed use purpose, like they create jobs, they need to create opportunities, entrepreneurships, cooperative for communities. So they are not devised to be only dormitory, but they are devised actually to be multi-purpose, creative, innovative cities. And they think this is so important for the future of Africa to decentralize these metropolises that most of them are capitals of their countries. So they need to be decentralized in order to create opportunities beyond only the political or the pure economic profit that is linked between the two. Next, please. Next, please. So one of the case studies I want to show you here, next, please. This one actually, the one alarming point. No. Keep this here, please.
Dr. Hassan, just let me tell you that the internet has a bit of a delay, so it takes a bit of time to get to you. Voice travels faster.
It's okay. Please, now I think what we should not forget about housing in Africa, please. 70%, let's say 60% of the population of Africa, they are still in the rural areas. This is a fact that we cannot neglect. So we cannot say we will solve the problem of housing in Africa only by modern cities, which is absurd. We need to decentralize the planning of housing from being purely urban to also a new rural. So we have Kautar Amini who is with us in the room, and she's one of my PhD candidates, and she's working on this notion of the new role, how to set up a new planning for rural territories with new offers of decent housing, even in the rural areas. We are thinking housing only in the modern cities in Africa, which is really abnormal, and not just for this population in the rural areas. Therefore, what kind of disruptive solutions for rural housing? This is why we are using the term or the adjective disruptive. Not only disruptive in terms of technologies, of course. Now, in rural areas, thanks to the solar energies, renewable energies, the soft infrastructure, connectivity. So the question of the city is not anymore a myth that should be centralized in one metropolis with crowded people around, with a weak infrastructure that are giving very bad image to Africa, indeed. So therefore, what kind of disruptive solutions that we would actually pursue to do decent housing based on disruptive solutions for rural territories? Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Next slide. So therefore, what the takeaway? So there are two scenarios. So the smart city movement. And what I mean by smart city, we just organized Africa Smart City last year. Africa Smart City Forum was demystifying this term. Smart is not about triple E and all the electrical engineering gadgets. No, it's about actually smart solutions that are community-based, that are actually very bottom-up. What kind of renewable energies, what kind of light infrastructures, what kind of connectivity. And even with one of our PhD students, we were talking connecting the disconnected African city. So that means if the African city is with of chaos in terms of in its grid, for instance. So what kind of connectivity we can create virtually to make this city performing as community members connected in order to resolve the issues of the disorder, physical disorder. And this is what we witnessed with COVID-19, for instance. COVID proved to us that community resilience was very important, and community members, they devised their own disruptive technology solutions, resolutions to connect, to get to services, while the physical infrastructure, it was not working. So the other thing, actually, embedding resilience into urban planning. The urban planning practices in Africa need to be revisited. We cannot pursue the Athens Charter. We cannot pursue the orthogonality and change the checkerboard urban planning. Africa has its own specific issues when it comes to African community, where tradition, culture is still there. People are still half rural, half urban. So we cannot just parachute the smart city solutions or maybe a fancy kind of cities just for the show. We need to be grassroots and bring this community back to urban planning and move with co-planning, co-design, and co-construction of these cities with the people.
Thank you so much.
Against the people. So what kind of co-design or thank you so much. So I want to answer your questions more. Thank you for listening to me.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rodwan. I will move the discussion now towards our first dialogue of the day that starts with a presentation. I'm just going to move a little bit to a presentation between Mr. Alan Kane, Mr. Jean-Marie Cachello, and myself. Can you please join our panelists by Zoom? Thank you so much. We really appreciate the tech team here and their really swift response to this. So we will start with your presentation. I will give you all the power.
Thank you. Okay, could you please put my PowerPoint on? Can we project the PowerPoint, please? Okay, thank you. Well, thanks very much, Mena. My presentation is on revisiting sites and service as a model. I'm going to some extent, build a little bit on the our previous presenter and look at the very quickly the evolution of housing approaches in Africa, and starting with the post-independence period, the 50s and through to the 70s. Most governments saw informal settlements that surrounded most of the cities as sorry, going backwards, yeah. These were seen as associated with products of colonialism, and a belief that with economic development in post-independent countries that the slums would disappear. Most of the strategies in this period involved urban renewal, programs of slum elimination, and building new towns. There were a number of, in Botswana, Malawi, Mauritania, Nigeria, and Tanzania, massive new capital city projects were built in the 60s and 70s. And these projects invariably contributed to the accumulation of debt that was carried over for a generation after that. Slum removal programs involved moving slum populations and to open up urban land for new urbanization projects, new housing projects. But in the late 60s and the early 70s, there was a major revision of the post-independent models. Public housing model proved to be very expensive and contributed, as I mentioned, to the African debt. Slum settlements, when they were removed, actually contributed to the a reduction of net housing rather than a positive growth of housing. The World Bank adopted new policies, largely based on John Turner's work in looking at new opportunities for financing self-help housing through site and service and slum upgrading rather than slum demolition. The social production of housing was a key finding of John Turner, and he argued for building an enabling environment for providing service land, allowing for incremental housing and slum upgrading, and also ways of unblocking the investments of families themselves by providing basic services, water, sanitation, infrastructure, electricity. Slum upgrading was seen as an in situ process where populations, families' assets were protected and respected, and basic infrastructure was improved. Over the years, it's been shown that slum upgrading has positive, but also the downside in many of the benefits were accumulated by the landowners, and it encouraged a gentrification process of the slums. But do you want to move? Okay. The new movement in from 1972 into the 80s was a movement for site and service, building on some of the principles of social production of housing, promoting the incremental and improvement of housing and provision of basic services, and the provision of microcredit to families for assisted help in building. The World Bank eventually rejected the site and service model into the 1980s because the results of site and service projects take a long time to materialize. None of the World Bank projects could demonstrate substantive results in the short project timelines that had been envisioned. And so the approach was considered to be a failure, or many of the projects in any case had been built at a great distance from the urban centers and increased housing transport costs for residents. Site and service approach was replaced and by neoliberal solutions, market-based solutions promoted by the World Bank through the 1990s into the 2000s. And sorry, possibly, yeah. But as late as the last decade, in a number of countries who've been able to benefit from Chinese credit lines, such as Angola, where I work, there was a boom of new town development again, largely benefiting foreign private companies who built these new towns, new residential properties. But since 2014, with the economic crisis and loss of commodity prices, this process of new town building with Chinese credit line has dried up, and many of these projects now remain unfinished. But site and service methodology has survived, promoted by civil society organizations, by NGOs, by an organization that we're associated with, the Habitat International Coalition, with the perspective of promoting the social production of housing, and that would allow slum and squatter residents to incrementally upgrade their housing. But also in private sector, in a number of developing countries, but also in developed countries, the model of site and service development, infrastructure development, and has been maintained and promoted by private sector developers, mainly for the upper middle class segment of the population. But also in many local governments in Africa, and local municipalities have maintained the programs of site and service over the years to manage land and housing within their jurisdictions. Sorry. I think you have to move this head. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Back one, please. Rediscovering sites and services is the theme of much of the current work of the World Bank, based on research published by the bank in 2022 that really assessed site and service in comparison to some of the other housing models that had been promoted over the years, and found that site and services approach actually probably produced the more positive results. They realized that their assessment of previous site and service programs was made too quickly, too early, and the indicators that were used were too narrowly defined, because many of these programs started decades ago are now thriving communities, and they just took years to consolidate and build. And the bank argues now for learning from these previous experiences of positive and negative experiences in site and service, and realizing that we need to look at the changing context, the economic context of cities today, and develop a new strategy for site and service development. I'm working in Angola right now on a program where the bank is piloting support for the government in developing a new site and service program in Angola. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alan, for this important historical reminder and the presentation. We've learned a lot from it. And now I wanted to open this discussion building on what Dr. Rodwan said and what you have mentioned now, and kind of hone in and maybe throw in the disruptive wrench into this discussion around informality, and posit, if we change our way of thinking about informality and think of informality as actually a fallacy, as somebody who comes from architecture, if you look at something that exists, something that has walls, something that has a roof, and tell me that it doesn't have a form, it's informal, that is really inapplicable to the way we understand the world. So if we stop thinking about informal and start thinking about it as a way of placemaking, and think about its blight as actually an institutional retaliation to the fact that it dared to exist outside the kind of bureaucratic system that in Africa we inherit from the colonial system. So if we change our perspective on these settlements and think about it from a different perspective, especially because if we think about building expertise, we find that most builders come from these units. Most builders in Africa, most bricklayers, most people who are in the construction industry end up being residents of these settlements. So I wonder if we are thinking about disruption, what if we just think about disrupting this term altogether?
Yes, Mena, yeah, I completely agree with you, and I think the opportunity is now to really learn from those processes of that were called informal housing, but it's really the housing of 90, at least 90% of populations who housing is built with capital that is from family savings and built with local artisans and employs local labor and creates employment. I think the key is to decriminalize this concept of informality and recognize that these processes are need to be supported, and we need to look for ways that the social production of housing can be supported and as I say, decriminalized. Yeah.
Absolutely, because it also precedes what we call formal housing on the continent. We have been building for millennia before these systems came in. So how can we kind of think about that as part of our heritage and think about what the problems that are engulfing it as a problem of colonial legacy, for example. I just wanted to ask our lovely tech team to join our colleague Jean-Marie to the conversation.
Yes, I'm here.
I think, I apologize, Jean-Marie, I think there is a bit of a delay.
No problem. So thank you so much. It is my great pleasure to join this panel. And then thanks a lot, Hassan, for your keynotes. I think a lot of elements browsing what is really going on in Africa in terms of planning and housing and the challenge. And then also thanks to Alan for giving us the picture of historical restructuring slum reforms in Africa over years. There are a few additional comments, not too much, but at least 2 comments. Maybe the first question we should ask ourselves, why did upgrade slums or informal settlement, policy failed over years until now, and what can be done? This is not me to answer. I believe not some of you can answer, but we leave it probably to those who are planning this. But my reflection are going to be only on 2 points. The most part of failing, I think, is the ownership. Because creating value added, and for affordable housing, the first mistake I can observe is that the land policy upgrade Islam building, we cannot be confused by building settlement because people need where to live and to sit and to put the populations. It's a question of ownership and legal protections, because this is where, country failed. If you give those type of affordable housing, this type of, connotation, is going to give really low grade and never grow. We need to build and destroy. There's no value for all this housing. In many countries, I visited the last few years, doing my research in China, for example, and Rwanda, Ethiopia, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, recently in Africa. There's so many really change I can see. You have modernizations, restructuring, but you still have those traditional slum maybe upgraded, but still really pity that really there's not any integrated, policy that to strategic planning to rely on this. my interest was maybe because I stayed in China a long time, in the 80s, 90s, until maybe almost 20 years. There were a lot of good lessons to learn from restructuring slums and then creative value added to slum and building modernization and housing. I think we can say that people, many cities used to be full of factories. I was in Shanghai before. And when they reformed the factories, near factories, a lot of slum housing, and they were removed the factory for modernization. And then there were a lot of new projects added that, because if you build those type of affordable housing, social housing, you need to create also element to support, like shopping mall, highways, because unless there are those value-added big projects, there is no way to live, to bring up those slums to be upgraded, because the ownership, there's no benefits for that. So my second point, basically, the first one, to create value added to this slum, not to see them only as a settlement, but the economic means really for those people living inside. My second point is about what I'm reading here in Canada, at least in Ottawa, the city where I live now. There is what they call 15 minutes community policy in the city of Ottawa. Last Sunday, I attended the city. They have a new reform for rural and urban linkage. That's where UN Habitat is promoting now, urban and rural linkage. We don't talk about rural only, but you need to link together housing issue and affordable housing crisis as a part of this. But to come back to the 15 minutes community, basically, I'm backing to what Alan was talking about, sites for building and the service behind. So 15 minutes community in Canada, people who visiting here could see cities are based on communities. Those small communities around the supporting services, connectivities, recreation parks, you have green spaces, medical centers, pharmaceutical. All these really are part to support the community. You move one community, you have maybe that's what Hassan was talking about, maybe the urban centers. We need to create a lot of small urban centers, only one or two big, because that's where we degraded really the community valued. So these are 2 points, in my view, we need to integrate in supporting those planners, but the economic means, the creative value I'm talking about creative value for those social housing, and also to be sure that there is service support to the community base and decentralizations. Yes, this is my my point of view to what Alan just gave us a broad presentation for now.
Thank you so much, Jean-Marie, for these points, especially the 15 minutes city. I've also been contemplating these ideals and thinking about the city that is walkable, that is resourced, that is kind of contained, versus these huge cities that we ended up with. I think we now move a little bit into our discussion, into our coming dialogue, and I think we're going to jump a little bit into our program and invite Professor Ben Gianni into this conversation. And I'm just giving a cue to our amazing tech team who are very swift. And I will make sure his presentation is ready for him to join us.
Well, assuming folks can hear me, and as Mena gets that PowerPoint ready, I just want to say how pleased I am to be here. My name is Ben Gianni. I'm an associate professor at Carleton University in Ottawa, Canada. Many of the group from ICASU are based in Ottawa, including Jean-Marie, myself, Mena. And so we are actually bringing that Canadian perspective to the discussion of housing in Africa. Mena, are you hearing me? And
we hear you. We heard all that.
All right.
And I see our tech team is going to get the presentation up immediately. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. And thank you, Alan and Mena, for being there, and Claude for looking after things from, there in Cairo. We wish we could be with you. So the title of my presentation, and this will be very brief, is called Community and Market-Friendly Approaches to the Redevelopment of Informal Settlements. We waded a little bit into the question of informal settlements and informality. So this might make sense or might be controversial, but this is based on work that I've been doing over the last couple of years. So let's go to the next slide. So I've divided the presentation into three parts: for preamble, principles, and processes. So starting with the preamble, the first thing we all know is that cities are growing. Most increases in the global population are taken up by cities. Africa obviously is growing extremely rapidly, and housing is needed to accommodate that growth. And housing affordability is a major problem. Here in Canada, we can afford to build housing, but we cannot afford to build housing that's affordable. In other words, the cost of land, construction, labor, et cetera, means that what we can produce in the marketplace is largely unaffordable to the people who need it. So this is a problem. In Canada, efforts are being made to address that on two levels. One is to increase the amount of social housing or not-for-profit housing. And on the other hand is just to look at increasing the supply of housing overall. So indeed, housing affordability in great part or in part is due to overall supply. Now, despite the challenges involved, adding additional density to already serviced areas of the city can make more sense than outward expansion. In Canada, as in elsewhere, certainly in Angola, based on my experience there, adding to the periphery is not always the best solution. It's not one or the other. The question is what degree you move outward versus what degree you move upward. But in order to move upward, you often have to add density to already serviced areas. And in Canada, this is called intensification. In other words, it typically involves replacing lower density development with higher density development with a focus on housing. The current goal in Ottawa, for example, which is growing relatively rapidly by comparison to other North American cities, is to accommodate more than 60% of all additional growth on already serviced land in or close to the urban core. So the attempt is really actually to stem outward expansion and actually replace low density development with higher density development. So in that regard, there is a direct correlation between, for instance, the redevelopment of informal settlements in the Global South with what we're doing here in Ottawa, though the terms of reference are quite different. In cities in the Global South, adding additional density often entails replacing relatively low density and informally built settlements with higher density formal development. And based on my studies, certain principles and processes have emerged around the redevelopment of informal settlements. And most such settlements occupy land for which some level of government holds title. This is especially true in post-colonial areas where most of the land is socialized. So we'll move to the next slide. So moving to principles, then, we want to focus our redevelopment on areas that are favorable to private sector involvement and investment. It's always controversial to say we want to get the private sector involved, and we always have to think about what the incentives might be for private sector involvement. But I can tell you that while government involvement is absolutely crucial, governments have a very poor track record, certainly here in North America, with building and managing housing. And we've had better luck with private sector participation. In the project that we looked at in Angola, a really interesting initiative got started, but then lost momentum when the governments changed, and the new government was actually unfavorable to the previous government's projects, and therefore stopped the project altogether. So when governments actually try to take on these projects by themselves, those projects can be quite vulnerable. And the private sector is generally involved in these redevelopments in exchange for access to land. So the private sector then brings both funds and expertise in exchange for that land. And when looking at sites to target for redevelopment, priority should be given to sites that are in or adjacent to the urban core, are along major transportation corridors and or at major transit stops. Before getting too far into it, one wants to really carefully consider the form and the scale of the replacement housing, emphasizing the need to maintain social cohesion and connections within the affected community to support informal economic activity and to meet all minimal standards for units to be traded in the marketplace. In other words, when one thinks about replacing informal housing with formally built housing, one thinks about communal kitchens, communal bathrooms, things that could bring the cost of construction down and may map a little more closely to the way the community currently operates. But some of those things could actually compromise the ability of that community to operate within the marketplace in the future. And we'll get into that in a minute. Third point is you really want to involve the community from the word go. You're going to want to appoint community leaders into the transition team and anticipate that there'll be a range of voices and points of view. In the case study that we looked at in India, the community was roughly divided between Muslim and Hindu, with very different sets of who spoke for the community. And even within those individual groups, we noted that, in fact, the older generation had very different ideas than the younger generation. And therefore, it's very hard to understand what works or what may be desirable for one sector of the larger community may not be actually what the younger generation is interested in seeing. You'll want to identify the terms under which enumeration will be done. In other words, how do we determine who lives in the community? And who counts and who doesn't and why? How long have you had to live there? What if you moved in last week? Do you count, et cetera, et cetera? These things are really hard to figure out, especially if the population of the community is in flux. And you'll want to provide clear explanations and assurances of what qualified residents will receive in return for relinquishing their claim on the land they occupy. Mistrust abounds in any kind of redevelopment. And you need to be able to present exactly. We found in India that it really wasn't until they actually built a model of the replacement housing and created a sales center, as it were, on site that people had any idea what they were talking about or what they were going to get. Super important to identify future obligations if and as applicable. We hear stories about Thatcher's right to buy, where people were allowed to actually purchase their council housing units, only to discover that they were being socked with special assessments to fix roofs or homeowners association fees. So indeed, it's important for people who are actually moving to this replacement housing to understand if and to what degree they'll be responsible for municipal taxes, for HOA fees, for utility bills. Many people living in formal settlements don't pay utility bills. They access utilities in very informal ways. And it's super important to keep in mind that many residents may not be literate or indeed familiar with formal systems of tenure or tenancy or finances or taxation or whatever. So all of this stuff needs to be explained. And then ultimately, it's important to use the redevelopment to provide training and employment for community members, and that every effort is made to assure that those involved in that redevelopment will have as deep a stake in it in the long-term success of the endeavor. Next slide. So what we're going to be describing here is an iterative process, and you want to begin the process by constructing replacement housing on an open or underutilized site within or immediately adjacent to the larger area targeted for redevelopment. In other words, you can't start redeveloping until you have some place to move people into. And so you need to, among the criteria you want to use for targeting which areas to begin the development is whether or not there's actually excess land available there. In the case studies, one of the case studies we did in Angola, it was a large satellite field that had been fenced in and was now technologically defunct and was available actually to build housing on. And then the whole process could be started that way. And so while redevelopment may not need to be literally in situ, in other words, on the exact site, it needs to be within the community in order to preserve social networks, continued access to existing transportation systems, enabling children in the community to continue to attend local schools, et cetera. And based on the experience we had with the case study in India, you want to avoid transit camps and other forms of temporary displacement, largely because temporary has a tendency to become permanent. The process of vacating the site in India took years. So there were people living in the transit camp for a number of years who ultimately decided they liked it and weren't about to move again. And then we had the same problem with the transit camp, how to get people out of the transit camp. And so you really want to avoid that in the first place. At the same time, next point, identify a site, in other words, parcel 2, on which to begin the first phase of the large redevelopment. And that site should be, again, as we mentioned above, attractive to private sector investment and have the capacity to support replacement housing at an appropriate scale and density. You'll want to move occupants out of parcel 2 and into the replacement housing in parcel 1 as soon as it's been completed, and demolish the existing housing on parcel 2. It's super important that that existing housing on the redeveloped parcels be taken down as quickly as possible, lest it be reoccupied by other people who will then have a claim to replacement housing. You want to offer residents free and clear title to the housing in which they move into onto parcel 1. and you want to set the terms of reference for if and when owners can rent or sell off this housing. You definitely want to determine mechanisms for monitoring and enforcing the regulations to make sure that, among other things, titles to units are not transferred on the informal market. I think Alan has seen many, many examples of this in Angola, and in the case studies we've done in Jamaica, this has happened quite a bit. Let's move to the next slide. So now we're moving, continuing in the process. Once people have been moved off of parcel 2 and into the new housing on parcel 1, we can begin the redevelopment of parcel 2. And this includes both replacement housing and market-based development. It includes new rights of way for roads and utilities, and it will include space for social infrastructure, parks, schools, etc. And in the case studies that we've undertaken, roughly 35% of the available land was allocated to the private sector development, about 10% to roads and rights of way, about 15% to parks and schools and other public infrastructure, with the remaining 40% dedicated to replacement housing. Obviously, this will vary from case to case, driven in part by the amount and sources of funding, whether incentives and subsidies are available and in what amounts. And then finally, from this point on, the process is iterative. You want to identify parcel 3, then you want to move residents from parcel 3 into the replacement housing on parcel 2, begin redeveloping parcel 3 with the idea that replacement housing on any given parcel will accommodate the residents of the next parcel to be redeveloped. And that's, for us, based on our studies, has been the way, a set of best practices in term for thinking about redeveloping or intensifying informal settlements. So thank you very much. I'm open to questions and discussion on that.
Thank you so much, Ben. I think now we move to the presentation by Professor Cheryl Boyle, who is going to be with us on the screen in a moment, also joining us from Ottawa. Hi, Cheryl, we see you.
Hi, everyone. I'll just wait for the first slide to appear. Thanks, everyone. I have a very brief presentation, but I'm first to introduce myself. I'm a professor at Carleton University, and I run a research lab. And so I'm responding to the particular question of disruption, but also agency with regards to looking at the housing crisis. And so I come from the position of Canada, but I reach out towards Africa with a shout out to a few projects in this vein. Next slide, please. My particular presentation focuses on 2 issues that are at stake in the Canadian housing dialogue. One, material harvest, and digital collaboration. And so I'll just speak about a few emerging research practices in housing that I think can be shared across nations for potential in the housing sector. There are 5 points and 5 slides. The first is about harvest, thinking about materials as finally we realize that the materials we have been using in the modern period are not good for us, that we should think about harvest as foraging, growing, tending, and caring to a community of knowledge for a community of materials, local and intelligent. The second point will be about hybrid construction. So thinking about materials perhaps that the knowledge rests in traditional or more sort of older forms of construction and merging that with new digital technologies. The third slide is about building at scale. So the potential of disruptions to be thought out at very small scale, which means much more accessible to a larger group of people, and then tested at a larger scale at some point, but as a demonstration. And finally, digital collaboration. It talks to Dr. Hassan Radan's point, basically that cities for knowledge and research need to be there, and we can digitize our conversation and our collaboration through connectivity. And finally, just a slide about building together. Next slide, please. So to the first point, the harvest, basically the dialogue now in materials or advanced research is about returning to a series of materials that are local. And to this, I believe that Africa has much to teach us, but we have much to turn around in North America. Materials made from biomass, such as wood, lime, straw, hemp, other cellulistic materials are making a resurgence in our most advanced practices for building. Straw has never been so strong in the conversations of advanced research in architecture. And so I feel that, you know, housing prototypes for walls, particularly in Canada for insulation from the cold, but also insulation from the heat, are really new paths coming forward for new wall types to replace high embodied energy or high carbon footprint materials such as concrete and steel. Next slide, please. Hybrid construction techniques. And so some materials such as mass timber has taken off. Mass timber, which of course for Canada makes sense, where we have kind of forests, which we can manage in the most, in the best way. We manage them as gardens. And so, in fact, are growing materials for our buildings. And those materials don't always kind of relate back to a kind of a super high-tech solution, but in this case, dowel laminated timber uses dowels in a very old technique of simple, you know, highly dried pegs holding wood together. And yet this is considered our advanced technology. And so how do we then bring that together? Next slide, please. And so one of the opportunities is with connectivity, and particularly the digital intelligence of youth, is to actually, you know, create digital twins of our buildings. And so by making accessible that kind of knowledge, we can kind of bring building back to many in terms of a collaboration by building these things so they can be seen, not necessarily have to have funding at the large scale, but can be seen in a digital model or at a small scale. And that moves to the point that Mena brought up. Next slide, please, is that we can kind of actually focus on research of for housing as disruptive when we think about housing not as a form, in fact, but as a process. And those things too, even at the scale of robotics, can be undertaken at very small scale or even just digitally modeled. And then when you have partners with larger scale equipment, you can test this out. And this is just a couple of examples of us testing small scale concepts of stacking a block at a small scale at a very small lab here at Carleton, and then being tested at a much larger lab. Next slide. And finally, these things have been tested, and I want to just have a shout out to an old classmate and colleague of mine, Steve Kovatz, who worked at the Agency for Open Culture, Rogue Agency, where he was working precisely on this idea that, you know, responsive and open source modular housing can be prototyped, working with youth. In this case, it was YEF Uganda, on projects using open source digital communication tools. And in fact, actually, the building project was constructed on site by the partnership in an open and digital collaboration. And I have full faith in the youth in finding these pathways, and I hope it will definitely create the disruption that's necessary. And last slide, I'm just really happy to be working in these kind of modes of old and traditional materials with new means of fabrication. And I think it's important that all of our labs collaborate, and we're very fortunate to share our lab space with Action Lab and Mena at Carleton University. So that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cheryl. And at least me photobombing all your activities at Sea Salt is appearing internationally. Thank you so much for this. I think before we go into our last dialogue, I would like to invite, on behalf of Mr. Amado Sardona, I would, Yanis would like to make remarks on behalf of him, right? And your remarks are going to be in French. Okay, please go ahead.
Excuse me, I'm more comfortable in French.
Absolutely.
Alors, il s'agit pour nous, à la Société immobilière du Cameroun, de répondre à la question des avancées en matière de construction, de recherche de pratiques de logements abordables en Afrique et au Cameroun. Et pour répondre à cette question, nous nous sommes appesantis sur 3 points. Déjà en matière de construction, où l'on parle de promotion de matériaux locaux pour la réalisation des infrastructures destinées au logement. Et à cet effet, nous avons engagé un projet dénommé Terre Ciment au Cameroun et particulièrement à la Société immobilière du Cameroun, projet Terre Ciment, qui visait la maximisation de l'utilisation des matériaux locaux pour la construction de 2000 logements sociaux sur toute l'étendue du territoire national, en raison de 200 logements par région, puisque nous en avons 10. Et la valeur totale estimée était de 4,2 milliards de francs CFA. Et c'est un projet qui, à notre sens, présente toujours aujourd'hui, se présente comme une alternative pour réduire de façon considérable le déficit en logement et peut-être même de lutter contre l'habitat informel. Et de manière aussi assez pratique, nous avons un certain nombre d'acteurs comme la MIPROMALO, la mission de promotion des logements locaux, qui, qui détient un état des lieux et qui s'implique assez activement pour favoriser l'utilisation des matériaux locaux à coût abordable, comme la brique. Et il y a des méthodes mécaniques et elles s'acheminent de plus en plus vers une méthode industrielle pour l'usage des matériaux locaux. Et d'un autre côté, il s'agit pour nous en matière de recherche d'explorer la possibilité de fusion entre la tradition et l'innovation dans l'architecture contemporaine, la mise en exergue de l'architecture traditionnelle et qui démontre une volonté de faire ressortir les valeurs, l'identité culturelle des communautés, puisqu'il faut tenir compte des spécificités. Nous avons 10 régions, par exemple, et nous ne pensons pas que l'architecture ou les matériaux usités seront les mêmes dans chaque région, puisqu'il s'agit ici dans cette session et même dans le forum urbain mondial de trouver des solutions locales allant bien au-delà de la fonction première de fournir un abri. Donc, cette manière de faire rend plus visible, à notre avis, la nécessité de créer des édifices, en plus d'être utiles, qui s'intègrent à leur environnement, à leur contexte culturel, à leur histoire et à leur tradition. Donc, cela garantit la création d'espaces futurs chargés de sens, de qualité et surtout durables. Et en matière de pratique, nous aimerions encore ajouter quelques éléments. Nous avons souvent recours pour résoudre le problème d'accès au logement abordable à des partenariats. Nous pensons que nous ne pouvons pas ne pas impliquer les autres acteurs. Et cette collaboration, entre autres, nous permet de procéder même à la rénovation de certaines cités, même si cela a du mal à être implémenté, mais nous pensons que nous y arriverons et nous nous sommes engagés dans ce sens pour la cité de Loncac, par exemple, en plein centre-ville de Yaoundé. Et on a prévu de procéder à la rénovation pour 1404 logements. Et également de contribuer au logement des personnes à bas revenus, comme les revendeuses qu'on appelle chez nous les Bayam Selam, dont on envisage de les encadrer pour atteindre ce but. Et nous devions commencer même par là. Un élément très important, c'est l'accession à la terre. S'il faut parler de logement, d'accès au logement abordable. Et nous voulons saluer en cela notre ministère chargé des domaines du cadastre et des affaires foncières, qui a mis sur pied un programme qu'on appelle le PROCOREF pour favoriser l'accroissement substantiel de l'offre en terrain pour les projets de développement de l'État et des autres personnes morales, soit de droit public ou alors les promoteurs privés. Et c'est dans cette perspective que nous avons réussi à acquérir, à densifier notre potentiel foncier et à mettre sur pied des projets qui permettront de répondre aux besoins de l'ensemble de la population. Donc, pour finir, j'aimerais également vous parler de notre contribution en termes de technologie une technologie qui serait bien utile pour mettre en œuvre et finaliser le deuxième axe de notre vision stratégique, notamment dans le cadre du projet Pizarotti de conception, réalisation de 10 000 logements à Yaoundé. Et cela passe déjà par la mise sur pied d'une usine qui est installée également dans la périphérie de la capitale et qui permettra à terme, nous pensons d'ici 2026, de produire 1000 logements par an, voire 1500, et de répondre aux problèmes d'abordabilité, de réduction des coûts. Mais pour cela, il a fallu également une très forte implication de l'État au niveau, par exemple, de la prise en charge des taxes avec les attestations de prise en charge des taxes de douane et des impôts. Donc, voilà, de manière assez ramassée, ce que nous avons comme pratique au Cameroun, à la Société immobilière du Cameroun en particulier. Nous pensons aussi qu'avec le lancement d'une nouvelle plateforme digitale de concertation de tous les acteurs du sous-secteur urbain, la plupart des problèmes qui se posent dans notre société et même à travers le monde entier seront résolus, notamment le problème de l'informel, pour que ce ne soit plus un fardeau pour les villes. Je vous remercie.
Thank you so much for bringing all these points. It's very, especially building on what Cheryl was saying and going back to traditional materials and the African ingenuity and thinking about contemporary manifestations of traditional materials and traditional African building techniques. I would like to kind of throw off the program a little bit and open up the presentation. I'll ask our amazing tech team to include Dr. Nahiduzzaman to this discussion. Also, Dr. Hassan Radwan. And I think Claude as well, to bring up the discussion around the thematics that we covered today, but also I would like to open it up even to our amazing audience. Thank you all for being here with us to think about the disruptive housing solutions for Africa. And just waiting a minute until our colleagues appear on the screen.
Hello, do you hear me, please?
We hear you, but we don't see you yet, so
yes,
it's coming.
Yes, you can see who well.
And I know the internet sometimes becomes a stressful thing to manage when we're on the African continent, which reminds us that internet is not. Oh, everybody's here? Oh,
concrete action.
I think.
Immediate step.
Okay. You should mute yourself.
Oh, are you? Oh, thank you so much. You brought in the entire cohort. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry, Mina, do you hear
That's
me?
great. We hear you, Nahid,
Okay.
very well. You have the mic.
That's me, right?
Yes, that's you, Nahid. Yes.
Sure, thank you. Thank you so much, everyone. Nice to be here with the colleagues. There are a few points I'd like to share with some sort of insights, because when you design this workshop, one of the key takeaways were how the three continents, Africa, China, and Canada, could learn from the best practices. Because every country has their best practices, and then what is the takeaways of learning process? That will be the important takeaway in this discussion. So I'll be talking a few points in this regard. Often, even though we look into construction sustainability and new modernism into the process of housing affordability, often we tend to miss out the vernacular design, which is being practiced for centuries, long time, and they are very much pro to the part of climate design, climatic response, and also other kind of settings in the vicinity. So I would say, vernacularity is one of the important aspects should be considered into modern construction, and how they could be an important input before they could be designed, molded very well to the part of, sustainability part. And also other thing is quite important here, the indigenous technology that we had in Canada, how the knowledge has been really important into the part of making housing resilient and also taking into consideration the future of disruptions and so on. So these two could be important elements in the discussion, even though we advance towards the part of modern construction. On the part of planned urbanization process, I would say urbanization is the key where people are moving a lot across the urban rural territories. Often we don't need to understand the key forces behind. Often, unless we really plan the urbanization well, it's difficult to really make sure that they have proper housing, availability to the market. In that regard, I would say if you have planned urbanization policies in place, this will be really helping a lot to understand the zoning in terms of where's the best possible zone for affordable housing kind of process, at the same time where the raw materials of construction is coming from. So we don't have such kind of zoning per se that regards to planned urbanization process. And at the same time, it's quite important that finance should be part of the game, because often, I think we talk about, different kind of vulnerability, modern design, construction, but when it comes to finance, we have a kind of dark side on that. So I think this should be very well talked out to the fact that how we can harness the affordability of those potential beneficiaries, and how that could be accounted for affordable housing should be a part of the discussion. Without that, only providing housing as a provider, not being able to sustain by financial support from the tenants could be kind of very wishful thinking and perhaps doesn't have much sustainability in the long run.
Thank you so much. Claude, to join the discussion.
Yes, thank you. And I will take some facts. And the first thing I want to start with is the notion of disruptive. Disruptive is the ability to prevent something from continuing or operating in a normal way. And it means that we have to cut totally from our approach. We have to rethink our behavior. And to do it, we need to avoid some fallacies that in Africa, the government is going to provide house for everyone. It's not correct, it's not true. Because most of the African houses are built by individuals, is the first point. So in case of being disruptive, is that you have to take stock of that reality and design a proper business plan based on the fact that community should be supported to pay back their loan, and they can do it. We need to accompany them, you have to train them. This is the first element. The second element is that we need to revisit what we call supported housing development in or on plan settlement or plan site and services. And by doing that, for example, in 2014, UN Habitat came out with the state of urban planning in Africa. And the reality is that 10 years later, I'm not sure if you have made the gap, less than 3 town planners per 100,000 inhabitants in South Africa. So we know, and some of the country were less than 0.05 town planner per 100,000 inhabitants. Whereas in the UK, in Austria, and in the US, it was between 12 and 37 town planners per 100,000 inhabitants. It means that we have a problem. The problem is that we are neglecting the town planning job. It's a field of expertise that we are not promoting. So to disrupt, we need, for example, to say by 2050, the continent will, if we just fix the minimum at 7 town planners per 100,000 inhabitants, we definitely have to produce 150,000 town planners between now in the next 25 years. So how do we do it? I don't know, but we have to think otherwise and think outside the box. The next point I want to bring forward is that when we talk about finance, currently there are 52 million adequate housing gap in Africa, which means roughly, if you take a house at 20,000 US dollar, which we said this morning is around 3 trillion million US dollar. You just take the case of Cameroon. By 2050, Cameroon will have to build 7.2 million houses, adequate houses in Cameroon, which means we need minimum of 127 billion US dollar. But to do that is not just for house. When we say housing, we talk about site, we talk about land, we talk about the road, we talk about socio-economic equipment, we talk about health facilities, we talk about field facilities. So how do we do it? We can prevent, we still have room to prevent. So I think that being disruptive will enable us to, as scholars and investors who are in the room, as local authority who are in the room, to think differently from the current approach. And I think to end here is we need to be people-oriented or people-led. We are evolving in different communities with different mindset, with different culture. How do we embed it in the process? Thank you.
Thank you so much for honing in on the point of being disruptive. I think it's a kind of the mantra of this session we're trying to really promote here. I think I'm going to move to our concluding remarks by Professor Huacao from University of Ottawa, and then we then think about it together as a community in this room. Oh, here he is.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, okay. Well, yeah, first one, yeah, I'm very pleased to be here. So I'm professor at the University of Ottawa in Canada. So I have been working at almost 10 years with my colleague here, for example, Ben and John Mary, and yeah, a lot of people here to running ICASO and to promote sustainable urbanization for both the three regions and Africa, continent, Canada, and China. So yeah, today I'm very pleased to give some closing remarks. So first one, I would like to thank all the panelists for sharing your valuable insights today. Our discussion helps us better understand Africa's housing challenges and how resilient communities can be built. We also saw how informal housing can offer opportunities and how sustainable ideas can be included in urban planning. Key insights include market-friendly strategies, creative design, and involve all the stakeholders. Today's exchange showed that no single region has all the answers. Working together and sharing ideas is essential for creating lasting urban housing solutions. Today's discussion highlights at least five critical insights for our path forward. First one, cross-continent lessons. Canada's successful construction practice, China's rapid urbanization management, and Africa community-led housing resilience provide invaluable yet context-specific lessons. Second, context-special solution. Our panelists emphasize that housing in Africa must balance affordability with resilience and planning, adapt to local norms. Its spatial justice and cultural appropriateness are also essential consideration in addressing housing issues. And third, market and social integration. Through fully implemented market-friendly policies can drive affordable housing without compromising equity. Fourth, formal and informal housing balance. Our panelists illustrate that informal settlements, when well understood, can contribute to sustainable urban transitions. Last one, planned urbanization. Strategy planning is essential for fostering housing innovation within broadly urban solutions. These takeaways reinforce the sustainable housing solution must balance economic, social, and environmental needs tailored to each unique context. Success in addressing housing challenges also depends on strong partnerships. First one, stakeholder collaboration. Engaged use is essential for fresh perspective and innovation. Second, public-private partnerships. aligning public policy with private sector efficiency fosters important results requiring innovative financing and risk sharing. Third, academic institutions. Research center like Carleton Architecture Lab and UM6P Central for Territory Innovation and Smart Performance link theory and practice. ICASU is also exemplifies global academic collaboration. Fourth, civil society, organizations like Development Workshop Angola ensure accountability and community connection. Fifth, international cooperation, expanding knowledge exchange platform like ICASU strengthens by a trilingual tie among Canada, China, and Africa. Technology transfer. It is important to adapt advanced technologies with local capacity building. Last one, research and policy sharing. Collaboration in institutions like we talked the UPCP, University of Ottawa, Carleton University, and also other universities in China, along with policy sharing through UN Habitat, promote adaptable solutions. Those partnerships are fundamental to achieve affordable housing goals. Our task now is to turn today's dialogue into concrete action. Immediate steps to strengthen existing partnership with UN Habitat University Research Center through actionable projects. Long-term vision align with United Nations 2030 SDG, especially SDG 11 for sustainable communities. ICASU will continue bridging Canada, China, Africa, expand research, training, policy dialogue to foster resilient urban future for all. This housing challenge is too complex for any single entity. Our solidarity today, unity perspective from Africa, China, and Canada make a beginning, not an end point. Continue this dialogue, pursue collaborations, and drive action. Every step brings us close to affordable, sustainable housing for all. Thank you again for your contribution. Let's advance together toward a more equitable urban future. Thank you. Merci.
Thank you so much, Oha, for summing up our discussions and also the work that ICASU has been doing for years. I want to, just as a point of housekeeping, ask our amazing tech team to include Professor Ben Gianni, who is now, I think, is in the audience. He got disconnected. And all the colleagues in, and I would like to open this in the spirit of disruptive. I know we're a bit over time, but I got permission from our tech team to stay a little bit longer and talk together a little bit, and challenge the Western construct of time and go over time. Can we bring everybody into the screen? Is that possible? Thank you so much. They are doing magic in the back. It's not easy to run all these operations at the same time. To open it up on being disruptive, I wonder if anybody in the audience has a comment or a question around this issue. Yes. Yes, sir, go ahead. I think in that microphone. Is it?
Oh wait,
Yeah, it's working.
it's
I
no,
can hear-
it's my voice.
I can,
It's what?
I
It's
can hear
working.
you clearly.
Okay, thank you so much. My name is João Domingos. I come from Angola. well, I don't know if I have a question or a comment, but 2 points that I would also like the panelists to comment on. The first one is about housing policy. When we see housing policy, normally we see the plan for the city expansion for the new buildings, but we do not see, for example, the slum upgrading included on the housing policy. Can you please comment a little bit about that? If the slum upgrading could be part of the housing policy and be included on this policy. The second one is housing for one. I listened one of our panelists talk about that. I agree that most of African cities, the citizens, they build their own houses. But in fact, what we have been also seeing is that on the other side, the government makes investments building a new cities for the middle and high class. But in fact, on the other side, when it's about the social house, the poor have to build their own house. What do you think about that?
Would like to take this first question, Alan? You.
Well, okay. Sean Dominguez, the issue around upgrading as part of housing policy, for sure, it's a challenge, and it's not always incorporated into plans. I mean, the discourse more recently is around slum prevention, and that's but we realize that in many African cities, 50-60% of the housing stock is informal, and the value of that stock can't be needs to be respected, and infrastructure upgrading is necessary for transforming that informality into in the formalization process. But it's cheaper to stop informal development through projects like site and service and providing space for new housing and service land to stop the continued growth of informal settlements, particularly on the periphery of cities. But inner city slum upgrading, there's no option but upgrading that space.
Yes, Ben?
Yeah, I just wanted
Go
to
ahead.
give the example. Delhi has a great slum redevelopment policy called
Ben,
slum.
I can't hear you. Or is it my issue?
I don't know. Can you hear me now?
Can you hear Ben?
Hello? Yeah, it's working.
Just a second. Professor Gianni was speaking, but we couldn't hear him for some reason.
Can you hear me now, Menda?
Oh, yes. So what,
Okay.
for 1 second, sir, 1 second, there was a technical issue in my ear. Sir, please take a seat for 1 second.
Yeah,
Yes,
no, just in response to that question, I would encourage the individual to look at the city of Delhi's slum-free Delhi policy, which is in place. That would be a good example of a city that's dealing with it. Delhi, like many cities, has put in a huge investment in a new transportation system, very similar to what we're doing in Ottawa or Toronto or China, anywhere too. And therefore, all these new transit stops are areas that have been identified for slum redevelopment, anything within close proximity to those. So the slum-free Delhi policy has been put in place for a while, and it would definitely be one to look at as a prototype.
Thank you so much, Ben, for the precedent, the case study. Please, sir. I'm so sorry for the delay.
I think his response equally maybe gives me a clue onto what my worries were. Because first of all, we've left from, at least from theories at what housing is all about to the practical aspects which are done by the urban managers. And one of the challenges of urban managers is this social housing, is the slums. And like my colleague said from there, in designing urban policies, these areas are left directly to the urban managers without giving them the leeway as to, because you cannot talk about housing when you don't talk about financing, especially the services Because what matters is, that is Claude said from there, from the project that we've been working with him in Bamenda, on the issue of, first of all, saying that people, you could develop the housing over a period and let people pay back. Oh, but what happens is the open managers now are charged with the responsibility of, first of all, ensuring the areas are serviced. Because if you don't do that, how do you now bring the people into such a development areas? So the question we're asking, what are the possibilities of having maybe funding for some of those issues of having the areas serviced and so on, so that it is now the social aspect, even if we're not going to tax the individuals for maybe putting in something to develop, you would have been assured from the planning aspect that we're talking about planners, from the issue of maybe ensuring that we don't again create further problems to come up. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I don't know if any of our, yes.
Excuse me.
Professor
Hello. Yes.
Ridwan, go ahead.
Yes. Thank you so much. Do you hear me? Do you hear me,
Yeah,
please? Do
clearly,
you hear me,
yes.
please?
Yes, we do clearly.
Yes. Good. It's really, I'm delighted to hear everyone, and of course, different angles, different scales to expose the issues around housing. So it's not like one side. I'm thrilled to see from the techniques and materials and the construction systems what we do in terms of resolutions on building the sustainable houses to the district or the neighborhood, to the level of the city, to the level of the region, to the national level. But I think now what is disruptive is actually how to look at housing as a comprehensive process rather than a quantitative solution to resolve a housing crisis. I think if I'm talking about my country, in the 80s, 90s, the target was actually to have around, for instance, 300,000 dwellings per annum to combat slums. I think, yes, we combated slums, but we came back with other types of slums, the formal slums, rather than the informal slums. So this quite one-sided policy of the government, like one of my colleagues said, to provide the houses for all, destroyed the banking system and the finance system for housing and for the private to take care of their own houses. And this is actually also exacerbated the crisis. That means the housing finance is a major problem. And different governments all over Africa, they should not work unilaterally as a bank, and of course, many states, they launch even banks for housing, banks for housing that are governed by the states. And this is why I think this PPP, private-public partnership P, and they will add the fourth P for people. So how can this could work with different layers? That means urban planning should not be technocratic and top-down. Urban planning, its purpose is not to see the traffic engineering and the vehicular orthogonality, but rather should start by the cell, which is the most important, vibrant, organic unit in the city is the neighborhood. So we know, and also this question of individual houses, they will not solve the problem. We have some mushrooming of this land speculation. The developer, they took over because of the incentive of the government, and they created jungles of concrete. So therefore, how can we actually include the strategic planning, housing in terms of neighborhoods, mixed use planning to create also job opportunities, education and health, etc. So I kept my story short. It is a very integrated process, comprehensive one, holistic one, and the most important thing, I hate to use vernacular, community-based construction.
Yeah.
It works over centuries. For the last century, it worked. Why it would not work now? And we named them formal. Do you know that is prohibited in my country to build in earth? Earth architecture is forbidden because of the concrete, and stuff. So therefore, I think we need to look at the legal framework to enable more genius, local use, to contribute to the construction system this construction system that is local, not only as technicity, but also typology of neighborhoods that we inherited from centuries of sense of belonging and sense of identity. And this genius, local genius, would be formalized within the policies, strategies, etc., and be adopted by the sectors of government. And actually, this needs a lot of time to disrupt the process, to generate more ghettos and social housing and stuff, rather an integrated housing pattern that is inclusive, sustainable, resilient, and why not smart? Thank you.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Radwan, and for invoking the C word on the African continent in context of housing, which is community, which we usually have all these contentious relationships with when we speak about planning on larger scales. I wanted to open one last comment from the audience, if there's any. If there are any more comments or questions or interjections. Otherwise, I'll just conclude this discussion. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you so much for this lively discussion about housing on our beloved continent, from our beloved continent. And we now are closed. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Mena. Thank you all. Okay, we will keep in touch.